Welcome everyone to the third seminar in our series on the policy implications of globalization. Thanks very much for joining us today. This session is being live streamed and also recorded. I'm very happy to introduce Nina Pavcnik. Nina is the Niehaus Family Professor of International Studies at Dartmouth, and her research expertise is in the intersection of trade, development, and empirical I/O. And as such, she's been instrumental in helping us understand the relevance of trade theory models, quantifying the impact of trade policy or particular trade reforms, helping us understand how well these trade models do in describing the world that we see. And she's been doing this often in developing economy settings, be it Chile, India, Vietnam, and others. And in terms of impact, looking at the aggregate impact, but also distributional implications of different trade reforms for firms, households, and workers. And as such, she is therefore the ideal person to take part in a seminar series on the policy implications of globalization. So we have the next hour, and we're going to run this seminar as we have the previous two seminars, where we hand over to Nina for about 40 minutes of presentation, and then we will have a moderated Q&A session. And for those of you who are in the audience, please feel free to write your questions in the Q&A, and hopefully we will have a chance to address all of those questions at the end. So with that in mind, I thank you very much, and thanks very much to Nina, and I'll hand over to you now for your talk. So thank you.
Thank you so much for inviting me. Let me share my screen. Can everybody see my screen? Yeah, good. Yeah, so I'm honored to be part of this online seminar on policy implications of recent globalization research. And let me motivate what I will be talking about with a fact that I actually found surprising. So given all the backlash against globalization, I was curious to see, how do people around the world perceive aggregate benefits from trade? Do they think trade is in general good for their economy or not? And what's interesting is, like, if you look at the data from Pew Global Attitude Surveys, on this graph I have countries listed ranked by GDP per capita, and on the y-axis I have the share of people in this country that believe that trade is good for their economy. You see that basically the majority of people in a large range of countries agree that there are aggregate benefits from trade. So in that way, the public at large is agreeing with the economists that trade has aggregate benefits. Where we notice that there is less agreement on trade's impact is when you look at the questions that ask people about how trade affects the livelihood of workers. So in this particular graph, I again ranked countries by GDP per capita, and then I have look at responses to questions such as, does trade lower wages, does trade raise wages, and similarly at the bottom, does trade destroy jobs, and does trade create jobs? And what we see here is that there is much more variation. In particular, there are a lot of people, particularly in richer countries, that believe that trade lowers wages and destroy jobs, whereas more people in poorer countries believe that trade actually raises wages and creates jobs. So there's, so you see that when we start focusing on distributional effects of trade and how trade affects livelihood of workers, trade becomes much more controversial subject. The other thing that's interesting here is that if you look at this data, it seems that people in countries like Vietnam and China are much more positive about how trade affects wages and jobs than even people in Latin American economies, and especially so from country like United States. So what I'm going to do today is mostly talk about what have we learned about the relationship between trade and jobs and labor markets. and give some kind of key takeaways from the empirical literature on this topic. One thing that I want to start off saying is that economists have, for a long time, focused on the effects of international trade on income inequality. And for a long time, we had predictions that trade will always generate winners and losers, both in developing countries and in developed countries. And even if we take a very simple model, like Heckscher Lean model, that has no labor market frictions, no credit market frictions, even in this world with no frictions, trade will still influence income distribution. And in a very simple version of this model, trade was supposed to bring a lot of benefits to low-income countries because it was supposed to benefit the less educated, hurt the more educated, so that it would generate aggregate gains for trade and simultaneously lower poverty and inequality. However, what we have learned over the past 25 to 30 years of research is that the effects of trade on labor markets in developing countries are just substantially more nuanced. What I'm going to focus on today is the period, kind of starting from mid 1980s to nowadays. And you see that during this period, no matter how we measure expansion of global trade, be it with total trade, merchandise trade, value-added trade, service trade, trade has expanded. This is the period that has been characterized by others as hyper-globalization. What I'm going to be focusing on is evidence that's based on kind of 4 decades of trade reintegration of lower income countries into the global markets. These countries have, since 1980s, implemented many large-scale trade policy reforms. And in addition, their trading partners have, since 1980s, also implemented policy reforms that affect the access of developing countries to developed country markets. And of course, then we also have integration of China into the global economy happening during this time. And one appealing feature of examining the effects of trade policy on jobs and labor markets in developing country setting is that because countries implement in so many different policy changes, we have policy changes that range from import liberalization to increased access to export markets. So we really have a very rich opportunity in these studies to examine how does increased trade, either through exporting or importing, affect earnings and employment. One thing that I want to mention there is, like, most studies that focus on developed countries mostly focused on kind of the effects of importing when it comes to trade policy. And the other thing that really benefited this research is that during, since 1980s, we just have a much broader range of rich data on firms, workers, and households that enables us to understand the distributional effects of international trade. So what have we learned? I think the main takeaway that, one of the key takeaways that I want you to take from this is that increased international trade is really not the main reason for why wage inequality or inequality in general has increased in developing countries. We reach these conclusions with multiple sets of methodologies, either empirical studies or kind of more quantitative approaches. However, this does not mean that trade policy doesn't matter for employment opportunities and worker earnings, and through that, to poverty and inequality. And in particular, one thing that we have really learned is that, kind of the effects of trade, even though they might not matter in terms of aggregate or explain the majority of inequality in aggregate, they actually have really concentrated benefits and losses within a country. And I'll go into that detail. So let me start with kind of the first takeaway I want you to take from this literature. One thing that we have learned is that where workers work, where do they hold their job, the firm, really matters. So we know now that firms differ quite a bit in their performance, even within very narrowly defined industries. And if you are a better performing firm, either producing higher quality product or more productive, you tend to pay more. We also know that if you're a better performing firm, you are much better positioned to deal with import competition and adjust to it, and also to take advantage of exporting opportunities. And because of that, international trade is actually going to widen the initial earning differences that are there for workers that work in better and worse performing firms. And the literature on this topic has used really kind of rich firm level data or employer level data. And what they found is like several channels through which this happens. So one thing that, for example, people have shown is that, when industry is hit by an import competition shock, employment in those industries is going to decline, but most of these, many of these employment losses will be concentrated among less productive firms. Okay, so that's kind of on the importing side. On the exporting side, trade also increases kind of wage inequality between firms in the industry because, as I mentioned before, better performing firms tend to pay more, and then these exporting shocks again increase market access for better performing firms in the industry, and through that kind of relative wage gaps between workers in those firms relative to everybody else. The other thing that people have also shown, though, is that education of workers in these firms also interacts with how well firms do. And in particular, when we consider firms from lower income countries exporting to kind of high income markets, consumers in higher income countries oftentimes demand high quality products, and production and marketing of high quality products requires education and skill. So, multiple papers have shown is that not only does trade widen the gaps between workers in better versus less performing firms, but also between educated and less educated workers in a particular firm, because kind of production and marketing of high quality goods that are exported requires skill. Most of this literature that I've just summarized is actually mainly based on registered formal firms in manufacturing. The second takeaway I want you to take from this literature is that we do need to focus more on kind of what's the link between international trade and informality when we talk about kind of the consequences of trade for jobs. And the reason for that is that even if we just focus on manufacturing, informal employment within manufacturing in many lower income countries accounts for a large share of employment. So just to give you a few examples, employment in informal unregistered manufacturing accounts for 70% of manufacturing workers in Brazil, 80% of manufacturing workers in India, and 66% of manufacturing workers in Vietnam. Actually, apologies, that's supposed to be 30% of manufacturing workers in Brazil. I flipped those numbers. So you can see that, like, if we are just focusing on registered firms, we are missing a lot of the employment even within manufacturing. The other thing that's why informality should be the focus here is that less educated workers are more likely to work in the informal sector. So to the extent that we are curious about like how trade affects less educated workers, these are informal jobs are actually pretty important for these workers because many of them are employed in them. So but even just more generally, if we go beyond manufacturing, informal sector, and here I'm also including agriculture and services, account for a large share of employment in developing countries. So this is a well-known graph that plots percent of workforce that is self-employed, which is oftentimes like a metric of informality, against GDP per capita in countries. And we know kind of the share of self-employed or informal workers is really kind of decreasing quite a bit with GDP per capita. And part of the reason why we need to be focusing on informality or be curious about it is because if we think about how can trade contribute to economic development or poverty reduction, well, it can if it promotes reallocation of workers out of agriculture and out of manufacturing, kind of micro enterprises toward more formal firms. And we actually have now several really nice studies, one by Ayrton and Dick, that actually look at these forces. So in particular, the study by Ayrton and Dick actually shows that, for example, China's accession to the World Trade Organization really helped move workers out of agriculture towards manufacturing and services. So in particular, the graph on the left-hand side here shows composition of employment in China from 1990 to 2015 WTO accession happened in 2001. And you see that during this time period, employment in in primary industries, namely agriculture, has decreased, whereas employment in secondary industries and tertiary industries has increased. And what they do is they basically take advantage of the fact that different counties within China differed in their local exposure to reduction in tariff uncertainty that accession of China to WTO caused. And what they find is that counties in China that were more exposed to these reductions in US tariff uncertainty, which kind of, basically made it more attractive for people to for either companies to locate to China or for people to export out of China, did in fact lead to increases in export and FDI in these counties relative to other counties, expansion of employment in manufacturing and mining, and importantly, contraction of employment in and investment in agricultural sector, and through that, total GDP per capita increased. And if we, in this particular study, focused only on manufacturing, these key kind of structural changes, workers moving from agriculture to manufacturing that we often hear about in, anecdotally mentioned, would really not be captured. This is like one of the perhaps one of the first studies that kind of really rigorously looks at this evidence and kind of emphasizes how that trade is in fact important for these movements out of agriculture to manufacturing. Let me give you another example from my own work with Brian McKeag, where we focused on Vietnam's trade agreement with the United States that occurred in 2001, and used it to examine how international trade affects kind of allocation of work between formal jobs and informal jobs. So this particular agreement basically lowered U.S. tariffs on Vietnamese exports in 2001, and you can see that kind of in aggregate, it very quickly increased Vietnamese exports to the United States, both overall as well as very much so in manufacturing. So that basically United States went from accounting for a very small share of Vietnamese exports to 20% of Vietnamese exports in 2004, and in manufacturing up to like 25%. And what trade theory would predict is that when U.S. lowers import tariffs on Vietnamese goods, these tariffs, if we have heterogeneous firms, would be more binding for better performing firms. So once these tariffs are reduced, one would expect more productive firms to expand, less productive firms to contract, and basically jobs would be flowing from informal to the formal sector, both kind of economy-wide and within manufacturing. And in fact, like when we look at the evidence, that is what we find. Let me just here focus on the picture, kind of raw data from manufacturing. What I have on the x-axis is, apologies. X-axis, I have change in U.S. tariffs as a result of this agreement. So basically, the more negative number is, the larger is the drop in tariffs. On the y-axis, I have the change in share of informal jobs within an industry, and you see that industries with larger tariff cuts, in fact, experience bigger reductions in informality. So, this evidence illustrates that it is in fact important to consider trade policy effects on informality, and it actually provides a good opportunity to show how general equilibrium labor market effects are important when it comes to export opportunities. In particular, what exporting these new exporting opportunities in the United States for Vietnamese companies do, they basically influence labor market outcomes of workers beyond workers employed in formal manufacturing. So, and they promote the allocation of workers out of micro enterprises to formal firms, or youth directly entering to these formal jobs. And what my co-author Brian has shown in his earlier work is these opportunities actually also increase wages in local labor markets, particularly for less educated workers. One thing that this shift from going from informal to formal jobs is not just about like earning higher wages. It also really kind of changes how workers are attached to the labor market. In particular, it gives you access to working longer and more regular hours. It makes it less likely that individuals are holding multiple jobs, and you do get higher earnings in Vietnam. It also means that you're more likely to receive benefits. But what this shift illustrates is basically it gives you access to more stable jobs, which are characteristics of more of a middle class life, as previously documented by Banerjee and Duflo. So that's the second point. The third point that I want to make is that trade has very geographically concentrated effects. So how a person will be affected by trade is going to depend on where they live. So in particular, the effects of trade, both on earnings and employment, are going to be very geographically concentrated and very unequal within countries, depending on how particular regions within countries are exposed to either import or export shocks. So if you're an individual that lives in a region that prior to trade policy changes has high concentrations of jobs in industries that benefit from new export opportunities, then you will fare better than kind of similar individual in a less exposed region. If you're an individual that lives in a region that has higher concentration of jobs that become much more subject to import competition, you will fare worse than kind of an equivalent individual in a less exposed region. And part of the reason why numerous papers by now have shown why we have these geographically concentrated effects of trade is that worker mobility across regions is very imperfect, especially in response to large adverse trade shocks. So people do move towards exporting opportunities, but it's much harder for people to move out of from regions that were adversely affected by a trade shock, in response to that shock. And we, from multiple countries, we actually know that there's kind of lack of out migrations, even like 5 to 9 years after these large adverse shocks. And this evidence is supported by pretty wide range of countries, including India, Brazil, Mexico, Vietnam, China, South Africa, and I'm pretty sure that there are other studies that I'm leaving this out. What I want to do now is just give you 2 quick case studies that illustrate the point that I just made, but also illustrate why when we are thinking about why is different country, how would trade affect workers, why context actually really matters, and we do need to focus on what's the type of trade policy experience and how mobile are workers across industries, regions, and also how mobile capital is across or how quickly it adjusts, as well as kind of where these workers are in the income distribution of a country. So kind of going back to the case of Vietnam and Vietnam's export liberalization as a result of US-Vietnam trade agreement that I discussed before, what I want to emphasize is that, this is a good example of a case where, we can very nicely show the concentrated benefits of export liberalization. So during the time period, even kind of before this trade agreement, aggregate poverty was declining in Vietnam. However, what kind of research shows is that if you were an individual in a province that had higher concentration of exporting industries prior to the agreement, you observed bigger increase in wages, especially if you're less educated. As I mentioned already, there was this reallocation out of micro enterprises toward formal sector, and household poverty declined in these regions relative to the other regions. What was also happening is that workers were migrating into these regions. Part of the reason why Vietnam might have responded so quickly to these export opportunities and why these export opportunities were fairly widely shared is that at the time of this trade policy change, Vietnam had fairly young population, and it had higher education levels than other countries with the same level of development. And that might have aided reallocation of workforce. We know from work by Rafael Dix-Farnero that younger and more educated individuals face lower adjustment costs. So here it's an example of a country where, trade policy helped, but also country like had, kind of what the composition of workforce was at the time also kind of helped with the reallocation. I will come back to this case later and also show that inflow of foreign capital was also potentially played a role. Let me now turn to an example where the empirical evidence was enabled us to measure well kind of concentrated losses of import competition, and this is focused on India's 91 import liberalization. So India lowered taxes on imports in 91, and work by Petya Topalova showed that during this time period, aggregate productivity in poverty in India was declining. However, if you were a family living in a district that was harder hit by these tariff cuts, you observed relative declines in industry wages, declines in agricultural wages, and actually relative declines, increases in poverty. Okay. Part of the reason why these effects of import competition were more severe in India is that during this time period, India had really low inter-district mobility of workers for employment reasons, even 9 years after the onset of reform. So, for example, less than 1% of rural individuals moved within 10 years, and less than 5% of urban individuals did. And people, what Topalova shows in her work is that people did not out-migrate from hard-hit regions, and the mobility is particularly low for the poor. And different papers attribute this low mobility to different causes. Topalova attributes it to rigid labor market regulations, and work by Dasgupta and Munshi and Rosenzweig actually links it to reliance of Indian families on informal social networks within castes, which generates disincentives to move away. So, the situation in India in that regard is actually somewhat different from the situation in Vietnam in terms of mobility of people that were affected by the trade policy change. Also, the trade policy change is different. In Vietnam, we're focusing on export liberalization, whereas here we are focusing on import competition. In reality, trade is going to be affecting imports and exports, and through that, some regions are going to be more affected and others will less. I'm just here focusing on two separate countries to illustrate these separate effects, mostly because empirically these two cases provide a natural way to separate these effects from other forces that are happening in the economy and affecting labor markets. But in reality, both exporting and importing is influencing people within each country. The fourth takeaway that I would like you to focus on from this literature is that international trade has actually long-lasting effects, not just on labor market outcomes of individuals, but also for the next generation. And there are multiple papers on this study, but I will focus on the one that follows up Topalova's work on India. So what literature has shown is that international trade will affect schooling and decision to send your child to work, through several channels, including family income. But this channel actually seems to be pretty important at young ages. So to the extent that international trade lowers family income, this will mean that your families will be less likely to send a child to school and more likely to send them to work. As I mentioned previously, Indian families in regions hit hard by import competition experience a relative negative income shock after trade liberalization. And what we observe in this region is that school-age children, especially girls, experience relative declines in school attendance, declines in school completion rates, as well as literacy, and kind of this implies declines in lifelong income. And what was happening here is that a lot of these families were living just on the subsistence, and when they were hit by this relative negative income shock, they pulled children out of school to save on schooling costs. This, especially girls who were actually pulled out of school, they actually did not participate in formal labor market. They mostly helped with family activities at home, or were idle. But important message here is that these one-time shocks to labor markets actually can carry on to additional generations. And we also have evidence on this from even developed countries like United States, in work by Mina Census and her co-author. The final point that I want to mention is that these adverse effects of import competition, and here I would mainly focus on import competition, are persistent and can actually amplify with time. And on this particular point, I will focus on evidence for Brazil. The additional, we have an additional study on these that shows this, like for the United States, and I think there's ongoing work in Canada that's actually finding similar effects. The reason why we don't have as much evidence on these kind of long-term effects is because it's just really difficult, especially in developing countries, to have data that can follow kind of long-term consequences of one-time trade liberalization episodes. So let me give you a little bit of background on Brazil's import liberalization, and then I'll show you the results. So Brazil, like India, also lowered its import tariffs in early 1990s. And what Dix Carneiro and Kovac did is they basically used matched employer data combined with census of population. So they were kind of able to follow either individual workers 20 years after the trade liberalization episode that happened in early 90s, or kind of regions, census regions. Okay, and what they found is that this negative effects of import tariffs on earnings, on relative earnings across regions, actually got worsened over time. Okay, and part of that happened because there was, like in India, there was lack of mobility across regions. Part of it happened also as a result of negative agglomeration effects. When earnings of people in manufacturing shrink in these regions, that also means that they're going to be kind of spillover, kind of agglomeration spillovers to a negative agglomeration, kind of spillovers to services. And what I want to also mention is they also show that part of the reason why these effects amplify over time is because capital also adjusts slowly. And the way they show, let me go show these results. So what they do is they actually check, like, how many establishments do we have across various regions that are differentially affected by trade liberalization. And on the x-axis here, we have time. You see that this is the beginning of trade liberalization here in 91, the end in 95. This is the pre-period, this is the post-period. And you see that all the effects that are on these graphs are basically the estimated effects of tariffs on, here, establishment size. And you see that, the average establishment size decreases with trade liberalization, but doesn't actually really change. Like at some point it levels off, but you see that the number of establishments in the formal sector kind of slowly declines with time. So what is happening? Well, to better understand what is happening is they actually kind of look at, like, what is happening to the entry of establishments versus exit, and they do that in this graph. And what you see, what you see here is that as a result of import tariff declines, cumulative establishment entry drops, and then it kind of levels off. However, cumulative establishment exit, initially exit increases initially, but you see that, like, it actually increases even more with time. And as a result of that, job destruction rate increases over time, and job creation rates is drops and is then it then doesn't new jobs are not being created. And the idea there is that let's say you invested into your company right before trade liberalization. Companies will actually try to make ends meet, and they will try to hold on, especially if they made early some investments, and they will only exit after that capital depreciation. And this slow adjustment of capital is leading to these delayed effects of trade liberalization episodes. So one thing that I want to emphasize here, it's not just like what's happening to workers that helps us understand how trade policy affects jobs and employment opportunities. So also like, the speed of adjustment of capital also plays an important role. And on that note, I just want to give you a brief glance of that also in Vietnam. So going back to the US-Vietnam trade agreement that actually improved export opportunities for Vietnam in United States, what you see here is that during this time period in Vietnam, we see that employment in the foreign sector, that's in the blue columns, really increased. Employment in state-owned enterprises has declined, and employment in private enterprises has increased. A lot of this expansion of employment in foreign firms and private domestic firms in Vietnam is actually because of new entry. Just to give you, yes, it's because of new entry. And what I have done with in kind of ongoing work with Brian McKeag and Wan Fong Wong is we actually examine how much did entry of foreign companies and kind of the capital inflows through that, as well as private domestic firms, contribute to this employment expansion. And what we find is that these U.S. tariff cuts actually expanded employment in Vietnam's formal sector, mainly by expanding kind of employment share in entering firms over time. There was also some firm exit. And most of that entry in response to U.S. tariff cuts was actually driven by foreign firms, less so by the entry of private domestic firms. So again, this is like another example of that. Maybe part of the reason why the Vietnam's labor markets have been positively affected by these export opportunity is because Vietnam also attracted new capital in the form of foreign investment into the country. So let me conclude. What are some key takeaways? I think when we focus on labor markets in lower income countries, it's important to consider the effects of trade, not just on formal registered manufacturing, which is kind of the most common in research, but also on informal jobs, as well as how manufacturing interacts with agriculture and services. The second takeaway is that gains and losses from trade are geographically concentrated, and from the policy perspective, these geographically concentrated losses that are persistent over time are particularly concerning. This in part happens because kind of displaced workers don't adjust. This is actually worse in developed countries than in developing countries, because work for Brazil has actually shown that unlike in the United States, where displaced workers stay out of the workforce, in Brazil they actually get absorbed into the informal sector. So informal sector kind of serves a bit as a buffer in response to this import competition. What is also worrying is that a lot of these labor market consequences also from import competition then have spillovers on other community outcomes, including education of next generation, and through that have longer term effects. And the final thing that I just want to mention is that the effects of trade on labor markets are context specific. The underlying economic forces might be the same, but how they will affect the labor markets in a particular country and kind of affect questions to answers to the questions, is trade good for the poor? Does trade increase inequality? those questions are, the answers to those questions are going to be very nuanced, and they will depend on the type of change in trade policy or trade patterns that a country is implementing and the underlying economic mechanisms. They will depend on how mobile the workers are and capital across firms, industries, and location. And they will ultimately depend on, where in the income distribution of a country are the individuals that are being affected by these changes. And I think that's, even though underlying economic forces are often similar that we can use to analyze these policy changes, kind of the local context does matter. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Nina. There's a lot to a lot of information that is really central to the agenda of this seminar series. So thank you very much for that. We've got some questions in the Q&A, and I think the panelists have some questions as well. I was going to perhaps start with a few questions. I'm going to interpret some of the questions that have come in the Q&A, and for those who have asked the Q&A, please do correct me if I'm not interpreting your questions correctly. The first one actually, I think, relates to the papers that you mentioned about Brazil and import competition following trade liberalization in Brazil. You showed that there was a reduction in the number of formal establishments. Is it therefore the case that people were moving back into informal employment and informal economic activity in the geographic areas that were adversely impacted? Is that?
Yes, yeah. So let me actually, that was something that I skipped in my talk. But yeah, actually the informal sector, the graphs that I've shown you here are all for the formal sector, because they use these matched employee-employer data that only covers the formal sector. But what one nice thing about their studies is then they complement that with population census that includes both formal and informal workers. And what they find is that in the sectors, in the regions of Brazil where that were more exposed to these import competition shocks, informal employment actually expanded. So what you observe is that originally, trade displaces workers and they go into unemployment. But then eventually they find the reemployment in the informal sector, and as a result of that, in this particular case, informal sector seems to kind of partially kind of buffer and smooth out kind of the labor market outcomes of displaced workers. And what they argue is that if you hadn't had the informal sector here, these workers displaced by trade would actually experience even kind of longer non-employment spells. And that's different from what people observed in the United States, where in part perhaps because of the way kind of social welfare works in the United States, the only kind of assistance that workers that are displaced for a long time can get is they can go on disability insurance, and that, then they get out of the and they go out of the workforce, and it's really difficult to return back.
Because Rimwell, he has mentioned in the chat, commented in the chat that this was perhaps similar to the impact of trade liberalization in North African developing countries. And I wondered if you also then talked about the slow adjustment of capital, so moving away from those sectors that were hard hit by import competition. Are there direct policy implications coming out from this work about the importance of reducing frictions within capital markets and that sort of thing?
Yeah, so these are all difficult questions. Please, if you have, those of you in the audience, if you have evidence on any of these effects from other settings, please email them to me, because I always love to expand kind of the set of studies I have on that. And there's just not as many. There are not as many studies within the African economies, and I would love to know about those. In terms of policy implications, to the extent that capital is not adjusting quickly because of capital market frictions, focusing on those frictions directly, probably it would be a helpful response. And kind of looking into the evidence that I've shown you from Vietnam, one potential reason, for example, why foreign firms might have entered much more, might have entered in response to these tariff cuts more successfully than private domestic firms is that because, a lot of these foreign firms are affiliated with large multinationals, and because of that might not, have access to capital that, a smaller private domestic firms in Vietnam, especially might not have, especially if, for example, the capital markets still prefer lending to kind of politically connected firms in the state sector. So I think that kind of checking what the examining more how do these financial frictions affect ability of firms to enter markets where there are opportunities or adjust. I think that might be a helpful thing to study further in this context. Yeah.
Actually, this slide brings us exactly to another question that was brought up in the chat about the role of state-owned enterprises. In the studies that you've mentioned and others, what are the are state-owned enterprises slowing things down, amplifying things in general when it comes to both aggregate implications of trade liberalization in developing economies, or helping or hindering, or is that question just too context specific to answer?
Yeah, I mean, I would imagine that the question is going to be very context specific because it will be interesting to see what how government in response to this trade liberalization is handling its state enterprise sector, and kind of that there's pretty large literature in China, and I think some people believe that part of the reason why China's liberalization was successful is exactly because of the involvement of state enterprises, while others believe that has deterred progress. So I think that's very much depending on I think that literature is still debates that. That said, we do have work from China that at least within the apparel and textile sector by Amit Kandawal, Pete Schott, and Chenjing Wei, that actually shows that, for example, this is very context specific. It's apparel and textile. It appears that the way Chinese government allocated quotas for the multi-fiber agreement was not to the most efficient firms. So when those quotas were removed, what you would usually expect, if market access opens up, is you would expect the largest firms to expand. But what happened in China in response to elimination of these quotas, it was actually there was net entry from private domestic firms, but especially foreign firms into the Chinese markets, which actually suggests that those quotas were misallocated. So I think how SOE is going to interact with firms with the trade liberalization episodes, it will be very, very very context specific. It's also difficult to study because we oftentimes don't observe the subsidies or cheap loans that governments will be giving to these enterprises. So oftentimes the effects are inferred based on an economic model, and then the findings will depend on the assumptions we make on how these policies, to the extent they are misallocated, correlate with the underlying true productivity of firms.
Thanks. That was Wanapong Durong-Karavaj who asked that question. Another question about movement into informality from John Morrow. So as well as the worker level benefits of more stability and general workplace benefits of being in the formal sector, higher wages, etc., Another benefit of formal sectors is a higher tax base in terms of everything is better recorded and better measured, and that has advantages in terms of longer term investments, such as in infrastructure and investment more generally. And John's asking, do you have any sense from studies about movements into formal sectors that these impacts are going to be quantitatively large in the long run? So a lot of new investment enabled by movement into formal sectors.
Yeah, I mean, this is an excellent question, and this is where I think trade economists need to work more with public finance economists to look at those questions. One thing that we I'm actually not familiar with too many studies that focus on that. Like, what we actually know is that even with import liberalizations in developing countries, in those countries, import tariffs were actually still a pretty big chunk of government revenue. So trade liberalizations are actually consequential for government revenues. And then how do you handle investments into infrastructure or schooling or dealing with distributional effects of trade when your government base is government revenues are lowering? Ideally, hopefully, like because of better reallocation, firms are going to grow and you can tax them. But I think that there's a lot of very interesting ongoing work by people like Dina Pomerantz and others that talk about like how do you tax this, how do you make sure people pay taxes and so on, and how that all interacts with trade policy changes adds another layer of complexity there. Like I'm actually hopeful that we will learn much more about that going forward. It's also not a literature I'm familiar with in details either, so there are probably other people who could provide a more informed answer to this question. But I do think this is an area where interactions between trade economists and public finance economists would be very beneficial.
It is broadly true that capital investments are complementary with aspects of formality, right? The risk, the uncertainty, the instability associated with informal sectors is very detrimental towards encouraging investment. I think that's another question that's just come up in the chat.
Yes, absolutely, yes. And then the big question becomes, then activity moves towards sector that you could tax more effectively, and then the question is like, how do you design the tax system so people actually pay taxes and so on?
We've got a few minutes left. I'm just going to ask if my fellow panelists have any questions for Nina at this point.
I do. Thanks, Catherine, and thank you, Nina. This was like fascinating. I have kind of maybe an unfair question because it's more on the labor side, but I was wondering your thoughts. I mean, it's fascinating, this cycle kind of that with the informal sector and working sometimes as based on what you said, as an adjustment tool when it comes to import competition. Then I wonder how much of this is a never-ending cycle in terms of are developing countries going to be able to significantly reduce their informal labor markets if it's all fitting into trade. So it seems like it's kind of a natural solution, but something that we don't really want it to be a solution. And I wonder if you have any thoughts on that. It's a big question, but just any open thoughts on that would be super interesting for me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I would imagine part of the way through which informality in these countries would be reduced is through kind of economic growth, right? Like we know that link is fairly robust. The question is that there are for example, in Latin American economies, informality tends to persist more, and then there's debate there how much of that is due to regulations both in the labor market as well as kind of on firm size and so on, right? So I think interaction both with economic growth and kind of regulation that governments have there does play a role, and trade as well as like any other shock, right? That it will be affecting formal versus informal sector firms differently will play a role. I think probably think we need more research on that. There's ongoing work by Penny Goldberg, Gabriel Ulicia, Dix Carneiro, and Costas Maguire, that they have a structural model that actually, I think, takes into account both kind of the labor market rigidities, I think they have informal firms, informal workers, and like trade policy there. And I think to really kind of understand how complex these interactions are, like you do need a structural model to examine that. Yeah.
Just as a quick follow-up, sorry, Casper may have a question, but just to follow up on that, is there any lesson maybe here for developed countries? I mean, it seems that I don't know exactly what are the mechanisms that in the developed countries this adjustment takes more time. Is it just how difficult it is to get a job? Is it the regulations? Is it I don't know if there are any lessons in terms of adjustment for where are the spaces to make it easier for people to transition to other jobs when the formal sector is the one that is the big one. And yeah.
Yeah. So, excellent question. And I, what I would say is that I guess like many years ago when I was presenting my work in India, people couldn't believe like how little people move. And then, the work by Otto Dorn and Hansen came out for, the effects of China shock on US labor markets. And you basically see, well, people also didn't move that much in response to that shock. I think part of the reason is like, why don't people move? And, in the United States, those have been related to, those answers to that have been related to housing markets that, in areas that are more depressed, housing is cheaper, yet, it's really expensive in areas that are booming, and that's precluding people from moving. I think work by Matt Notobotigdo has shown that like that interacts also with kind of the level of education. The other thing that's an issue in the United States is that the way the social insurance system works, it's basically you want social insurance to basically help individuals when they lose a job, but you want to design it so that you're protecting the individual, not the job per se. And like and you want to minimize this incentive to exit the labor force. Yet the way with long-term social disability insurance in the United States, people that are struggling, they exit the workforce, and it's much harder to get back. So having like better designed policy that help individuals transition rather than transition, I think are actually would be helpful.
In the last minute or two, I'm going to leap in with what is certainly an unfair question, but on behalf of Casper and myself, if you were to say, I'm starting, I want a research agenda from scratch. I'm thinking about what the important questions are. What do policymakers really need to know and don't seem to know much about? What do you think are those big unanswered questions that we all should be working on? Sorry for bringing this on you.
That is a big question. Yeah.
You mentioned public, for policy makers, the intersection between questions in public finance and public economics and trade policy.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. Honestly, actually, one thing that I would want to emphasize, there's a lot of great ongoing work, either using this administrative employer data in now also from developing countries, or randomized control trials that help us understand, like, all these factors that, kind of this literature that I overviewed much better. Like, so I think, part of the reason why we've made big progress in this literature is because data became better, and it's continuing to become better. So I think we will be able to get even more nuanced understanding. I think one thing that it would be, I think it's two things here that would be are helpful is, why do firms not grow, right? So like I find that a lot of current experiments that kind of examining kind of on medium-sized firms, like, you give people information or you give people know-how on how to create how to produce a product, like thinking about the work on Egyptian carpets by Amit Kandewal and David Atkin and Adam Osman. I think a lot of those experiments help us understand how firms respond, like when we eliminate some sort of friction, and that that size of a firm, it's particularly helpful to understand when we are thinking about like how do poor get integrated into the global work. The other area where I see kind of room for and there's already work there is experimentation with active labor market policies. That's a perfect example where we can do kind of smaller scale randomized controlled trials to see what works and what doesn't work. And David McKenzie has a great review of that literature. Like, it's a fairly pessimistic review of earlier studies, because a lot of things that people have tried in terms of wage subsidies, information campaigns, matching workers with employees, they don't have really large effects, but some of them are also like fairly small scale, so they might have not power to detect those events. So I think both researchers are learning how to study this better, as well as like they're cooperating with policymakers. So I'm actually hopeful that through that way, again, we'll be learning, how are we better matching workers to employers where there is a demand.
That's great. Lots of exciting things to do and learn. I think we are at time, so I'd just like to wrap up by thanking you very much for sharing these insights with us today, and thanks to all of you in the audience, and thanks for the Q&A as well. And I should have said at the beginning, this seminar series is brought to you by the CEPR, the German Development Institute, the Brookings Institute, and the CEP. We're all very interested in the policy implications, so thank you for helping us further that objective.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks very much. Bye.
Bye.